All right, I guess we'll get started. My name's Dr. Linda Baum. I'm a professor here in the Department of Counseling and Psychology. And we're doing a panel here on flourishing in practice. So if we want to start by just kind of going down the line, introducing yourselves. I don't know if everybody's kind of got introductions already, since I know we're coming up on the end of the summer school. But introduce yourself and maybe talk about how flourishing applies to your practice, however you might define practice, your own practice.
All right, you're looking at me. I'm reading your mind. So I'm Jen Ripley, and flourishing in my practice, a lot of my practice is training graduate students, and there is a good bit of trying to think in terms of strengths-based work. A lot of training students is finding what are you good at, what are you gifted at, and naturally gifted by God for who you're meant to be and the kind of psychologist you're meant to be. And that's really interesting and fun work to do and conversations to have in the mentoring roles, such that, even to be able to say like, well, maybe you're not that great at doing the paperwork. So you might have to come up with ways to keep up with that and make sure you're ethical. Let's do at least ethical work there, right? But you're so warm and you're so inviting, and your clients, they love you, and you're able to say hard things. And so I find that kind of flourishing work really exciting and fun, and to be able to have that mentality in my work is it's rewarding, yeah. Mm-hmm.
My name is Rachel Stevens, and I'm a professor in the School of Psychology and Counseling and program director for the PsyD program. And I would second all that Dr. Ripley said in terms of graduate training. Also I have a small clinical practice, and that's more focused on, I work with a lot of trauma survivors and pursuing post-traumatic growth and resilience through especially relational violence and things like that. So in being involved on Dr. Counted's research team and thinking more about flourishing, that's been interesting for me in terms of trauma recovery work, that how do we flourish through very difficult times that we would never wish would be part of human existence, and yet are a fairly common reality too. So I think that's, for me, I think of it in terms of that kind of resilience piece in terms of my clinical work too.
I'm Ev Worthington, and I sit around with my feet up all day. I'm retired, a Commonwealth professor of psychology down at VCU, which means that I have this salary that just won't quit. That passes for humor. So I, really have identified with the flourishing back before we ever thought of it as flourishing, because it just seemed to be things that I did, both clinically and also in terms of research. So, dealing with relationships and the hope focus approach that Jen has drugged me through all these years.
Lies.
And then mental health and physical health. I just have done that from the beginning. The virtue and character strength, those are my research topics. So those turned out to be things that I've just valued and always done. And now that I'm retired, I have to find things to keep me off the streets and out of trouble. And so I'm going to have to report Regent to the NCAA for use of steroids in cookie manufacturing.
It's so big.
It's pretty amazing. Well, that's enough.
So, first question is, why do you think that we as humans struggle with flourishing? And whoever wants to respond.
Yeah, I was struck yesterday when we were listening to them talk about how we're, barred from Eden, basically, right? Like that one of the difficult things about living in the now and not yet is that things are not the way they're supposed to be. We are in the desert, as Bill Hathaway talked about. And maybe we have access to the oasis, and we have access to Jesus, and we have access, as far as all humans everywhere, we have access to all of the scriptures, and we have access to so much theology and so many resources to, water our plot of land. But it is a desert, and we are not in Eden, and things are not the way they're supposed to be, and good people die, and terrible things happen, and traumatic, awful things happen to everybody. And that is a basic underlying difficult reality. And so because of that, I think any effort we have to flourish, to make a beautiful little garden in our little space of whatever short time that we have on this earth, with whatever resources that God has granted us, is really admirable. Because there's always going to be a pull to kind of why till up the ground again? Why that something awful happened again, and the political realm is horrible again, and and family life goes up and down, and every family and in every personal life, health goes up and down, and yet we hold on to this hope of what the future would be, that there will be a day when there will be no more tears, and I think that's what keeps us going. If I can wax philosophical for a minute.
I think I'll probably say things that aggravate folks. I'm sorry about that, but not sorry enough not to do it. But I think in a lot of ways, we don't really pursue flourishing. We live our lives, and most people just go about day to day trying to survive, and then they come to counseling because, how many people have come to you and said, gosh, I'm just not flourishing well enough. That's why I expect insurance to pay for this. No, they come to counseling because they have problems, and they want you to solve their problems for them. And so they're not thinking a lot, I think, about flourishing per se, the way that we think about it in academia and even academic practice. And so, people are struggling with life and with suffering, with the crisis du jour. And so I think that's why we don't pursue flourishing. It's not on top of the agenda. It's something in a way that we in the United States can look and say, oh, we have a lot of resources that we, can cover most of the needs that we have. Even the poor people in the United States have more resources than the rich people in most of the world. And so we can look at the luxury of saying, yeah, we should be pursuing flourishing. But I think the world is not like that. So I think that's why we struggle with flourishing.
That makes me think of in the New Testament where I forget who it was that was talking with Jesus and said, I believe, but help my unbelief. That there's this part of us that desires the good life and flourishing and wholeness, and also our brains look for quick fixes and comfort and self-serving patterns. And so, to really actually live a life that pursues flourishing in a holistic way, I think takes a lot of intentionality that part of us doesn't want to do. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
So you may have kind of hit on this already with your responses there, but are there things particular, that you see as something that's going on with American culture right now that is, detrimental to our flourishing as people?
Well, I couldn't avoid looking at the television last night. We don't have a functioning television, so I never see that at home. But I happened to turn on the television, and that seems to be the perfect answer to that question. What's wrong with America is, we have this cancel culture, and we have, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're not worth anything, and this polarization that pervades pretty much the world, really, but certainly in the United States. And I think if I had to name one thing about the United States that is, standing in our way of flourishing, it's this basic judgmentalism that we have toward anybody who disagrees with me.
I've been reading The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which has made me, it's making me a hater of social media. But, at least in his conceptualization of a lot of data, that the way we are trading out real connections with communities for online interactions with communities that have very low bar for entry and very low bar for leaving too. If you disagree with someone, you block them, you unfriend them, you leave the group, and there's very little social fallout, whereas we had to learn to navigate conflict and difference in relationships when you're face to face with someone. So I think that chipping away of some of the kind of social connections and what it means to live in relationship with one another has a detrimental effect on our flourishing as well.
You literally answered what I was gonna also reference Jonathan Haidt and The Anxious Generation. If you haven't read that, you should. Or David Brooks has a new book out as well about relationships and that, like, relational skills and relational priorities are in decline in America and Western cultures. I think it's not just here, but Western ideas are playing out in such a way that it's really leaving people without a chance to work through conflict, to improve their own ideas. And so people are ending up, C.S. Lewis's God in the Docks had the idea of hell is people have their big ideas and they keep going further and further and further away from the central town, and they get further and further and further away from it. And I think that he was a little prophetic about, people go off into their social media little group, their little unusual ideas, and they go further and further without someone saying, hey, that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't do that. And someone who loves them especially. So, yeah.
You all kind of talked about a relational component there, but something that I've been thinking a lot about since yesterday, Joe Miller presented kind of a theory that was really identity focused, and so relational identity was kind of part of that. But I don't know, any thoughts about that specifically, even just from experiences that you had with students or clients, thinking about how issues of identity might be central to a difficulty with flourishing. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, one of the things about identity in the West, especially, is that there's a self-made identity, like it's a self-created identity. And you contrast that with Eastern cultures, which is a socially made identity, right? So if I lived, particularly in a non-Westernized Eastern culture, I would be told what I am by the town, by the family, right, by the community. This is your role, this is your job, this is everything, right, on that end. And we're kind of the complete other end of the bell curve, right? Where it's like, no one can tell me what to do or who I am. No one has an influence on me. How dare you? And in fact, I can even have moments in my own history where I went, you didn't put me in a box. Nobody puts baby in a box, So So I think that's part of the culture, but the extremes of that, I think, are really where there's a lack of health and flourishing. That there's a balance to having a social group that collectively works together for the best of the cultural group or the village, or for what everybody is doing and what is needed. We have a million social influencers. We don't need a million social influencers. We do need a lot more plumbers. And if you have tried to get your air conditioning fixed lately, you can't get somebody hardly, to do that, because we need a lot more people to do these jobs. And so it would be great to influence, young ones and their identities for that. But also, not completely like, I'm sorry, you have no choices. You will be a plumber, and I don't care what you want. That's not okay either.
I think your question made me think of this very anecdotal, but I don't, for my private practice, I don't necessarily advertise myself as a Christian psychologist, but I think just because of where my education is and where I work, I get a lot of clients who are like faith adjacent, but not, a lot of folks who have been really wounded by the church and maybe not currently identifying as Christian, but want someone who understands like where they've been. And in some ways, there's such a rich view of flourishing and what that means in the gospel, and also like we get that so wrong in how we convey that to people sometimes in church settings, and I think that has kind of broken my heart sometimes listening to my clients. I'm thinking of one in particular who she's like, how am I ever supposed to feel good about myself if I feel like I was just always told I'm just a piece of dirt, a piece of sinful dirt, and that this is who I am at my core, and I just can't, there's just this sense of shame that follows me. I'm like, man, that's not the gospel. That's like a piece that is so limited. It's not the full picture. And so I was just thinking about, how does identity, even in church settings, sometimes get a little maligned or twisted to not have that fullness in it?
So this is going to be a terrible little anecdote. I was in Australia last year. I was invited over by Maureen Miner. I saw, her description is in the brochure. So she was joined online to the round table, so you can read about Maureen. But they were asking about the individualism and collectivism. So here I was on a panel with an Aborigines, a person from a different country, a person who had been a missionary all over the world, and then me from the United States, and I kind of felt a little bit out of place, but I realized my identity was not really a product of just individualism. That's a really main effect, that I am a father, so I'm connected to my, kids, and I'm a husband, and I am a member of Christ Presbyterian Church, and I am very connected with the church. And I went to VCU, was on the faculty, was a counseling psychologist, affiliated with everybody in the known academic universe. I was affiliated with, developmental, with social, with health psychology. I'm a joiner, basically. So anyway, the night before, I had gone to a play, which was a play about Elvis. It was the world premiere play about Elvis. This is in Sydney, Australia. And when the break came, 8,000 people went to the bathroom at the same time. And the bathrooms, and this is where it gets dicey, the male bathrooms are just a wall. and with a trough for the catching the liquid. And so here I was standing shoulder to shoulder with about 20 guys having one of the most communal experiences in this, individualistic culture. And it made a big impression on me. I've been in counseling ever since. And I'm glad to hear that you do trauma counseling.
Not that kind.
At any rate, I think our identity really is, more than we give it credit for, shaped by the things that we commit to in our life. And it's not just rampant individualism. That we have more individualism than a lot of cultures, but we also have a lot of collectivism. And if we just focus in on that, we can see, especially if we're Christians and we're oriented toward others and lifting them up instead of putting them down, then we have a lot of connections that are collectivistic.
No PowerPoint. You never know where it's going to go, right? It's the beauty of a panel.
What an idea. I can hardly wait for my next talk on collectivism.
So Rachel, you were talking, actually your response brought me to the question of, interacting with individuals who talk about maybe how their faith is negatively impacting their ability to flourish. And so I don't know if you have other thoughts about that, Rachel, or if other panelists would like to speak to kind of those areas where we might need to be more attuned to listen.
I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say on it. That, like I said, the client I'm thinking about in particular, she's kind of at a point where I don't know how she would define her own faith, but that wrestling and not imposing my own. I find it tricky as a clinician to. I feel like I can see through a door where there's this rich, the richness, and also I can't drag her through that door. And also, like, my heart breaks that she's in this place that feels so just crushed into the ground, and her faith too. So for me, at least, it is a lot of prayer and asking for wisdom. But I don't know. I'm just trying to make space for that questioning. I don't. Love to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, forgiveness would be an issue, but I'll let the expert maybe address that one.
So he knows something
Yeah,
about it.
he knows something about forgiveness over there. And what to do with church hurt, which some folks on the team have done a little bit of work on church-based hurt because it's very real. Mm-hmm. I'll tell maybe a little bit more of a personal story about it. So I was a teenager. My husband and I were not married yet. I was joking with someone that I got married when I was 9, but I just had an anniversary yesterday. And I've known my husband since we were middle school, right? And we were friends and youth group couple, all that kind of stuff. And when his family was in high school, his dad was asked to leave the church because of a trans youth group leader of ours. There's a whole long story behind that. So we got introduced to church hurt early in high school around that issue. And trying to navigate that as teenagers and as young adults, it was really, really important for us to do. So here we are, we're young adults, and we're in Richmond, Virginia. And someone named Worthington asked us to come to church. And we hadn't really, I'd gone to a Christian college, and I had done some work on all that. Jeff had been in the Navy and hadn't had as much time to do that. So that church community changed our lives at Christ Presbyterian Church. It really did. And so it was years, right? It was years between age 16, 17 when all that happened, and 25, 26, when the healing started to happen in the church. And I'm so grateful that it happened in the church. And we still have beautiful outcomes from that today in our own personal lives because of that. So I think that there's real hurts and there's real struggles and there's real problems anytime you got a bunch of simple people together. But there's also a space for healing in a church community that can't happen anywhere else. So I had a bit of a testimony there. Yeah.
I so appreciate Jen being in that church that, and part of that. And we've really been blessed by that ourselves. I'm still hung up on the collectivism thing. And I got to thinking about how connected I feel with the people I've been privileged to work with over the years. And Jen has been an enormous blessing over the years. And, I mentioned how she dragged us around in the dragged me around in the Hope Focus. She was a student, and she came up with this idea that we could actually run Hope Focus groups out of the clinic next door. What an original idea. That was just fantastic. But the other person I wanted to just notice today is Richard Cowden. I see you back there, Richard. So one reason is that today's Richard's birthday. Oh, yeah, I thought I didn't know. Yeah. So Richard, I don't know, I feel like we ought to sing, but I don't want to sing because, it will just clear the entire room if I start singing. But I did want to just say, kind of a little history of how I got to working with Richard since his birthday today. Richard is, I was running a project in South Africa. Richard's South African, and had come back to the United States for a degree and played tennis there, and was a kind of champion tennis player. And then went back to South Africa to work on his dissertation. And the guy so this grant was really about building capacity to do research in West Africa, a number of countries, and in South Africa. And the guy who was running the esteemed faculty person who was running the South African end of things was enormously busy. He was on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was doing lots of things. And so he recruited Richard to be kind of the project director. So I ended up really being, in a lot of contact with Richard and realized what an amazing person he was. It's like he can do everything. He can manage projects. He was working on a dissertation. He's doing some publications on the side. And now he's gotten to the place where he publishes something every Wednesday, whether it needs to be published or not.
It's so true.
And on Monday and Tuesday, he's doing analyses for other people. So anyway, Richard has been just a joy to work with ever since that. I don't know, when was that, 2015, 2014? Yeah, so it's been a great 10 or 11 years, and hopefully that will continue. So thank you, Richard. Happy birthday.
Well, I could just add something from the crowd. I think that a testament to Ev's nature is when we first talked, basically we connected on Thames, and I was like, I don't know anything about forgiveness. Like, I barely applied it to my own life, still young and whatnot. And he was like, don't worry about it. He was like, let's go for it, And so I think that's, thinking about individualism versus collective. That's totally opposite, I think, of the stereotypical individualistic mindset. It was just like all embracing, like you've got it. I'm just going to help you along the way, So I think that is partly why it's had this impact, so instrumentally in people's lives, not just thank you for all the opportunities. Yeah, it's been remarkable.
Amen.
So we got a little away from it.
It sounds like support is key to flourishing then. Let's apply that a little bit more to the bigger context then of church. How can we best support our churches in flourishing?
So, Linda sent us around a few questions to think about ahead of time. And one of them was about, if we were going to join a church, wanted to join a flourishing church, how would we choose that? And I never could get that. I couldn't get past that question. That was kind of the whole thing. So thinking about it, flourishing churches, I thought if I were choosing a church, and I've been a member of Christ Pres for 54 years, not that long, about 45 years, I guess. So I'm not looking for a new church. But if I were looking for a church and just kind of moved in the Richmond area, I would think, really in a very self-interested way, how can this church help me grow? How does this church align with my mission? Can I do my mission through this church? How do I connect with the pastor of this church? Is this pastor really simpatico with me? How about the people in the church? How do I connect with? Would I, really fit with them? And I think the reason people leave churches often is they feel that they don't fit with the pastor or they don't fit with the people. And maybe that's for a theological reason, but maybe that's a personality reason. So as I thought about all those things that would attract me to a church, that's where I started to realize those things are not the same things that keep us in a church. That we join a church and we make this commitment. And a lot of people leave churches because they can't get past the idea of, I'm looking for this church that will fulfill me. Whereas, if we're looking for a church that we can serve in, that we can bless the other people in the church, that we can, live out God's mission, whether I connect with them right now or not, things change in churches. And there are times when I didn't connect with very many people in Christ Pres. There were times when we didn't have a pastor for 3 years. We were searching for a pastor. So if I were in the mindset that I'm going to evaluate my presence in the church on the basis of what I might look for in a church, well, I would look for a different church. But if we evaluate our presence in light of how can I bloom where I was planted, if you will, then I think we make a real different decision. I didn't answer exactly the question, but you asked that question. You haven't asked it yet.
You're ahead of the game. Always a good thing.
So it was on the agenda. I should have waited. That's why I study patience.
Yeah, I think there was some conversation yesterday about how flourishing means that not only the good of the individual but the good of the community too, and that kind of resonance. And so I think one of the things in my own church that I really love and have felt like I have grown through is the commitment to also trying to work for the good of the community. And that one of the things they kind of ask a lot is if we stopped if we cease to exist tomorrow, like, would anyone notice besides the people who show up on Sunday? And like that, there should be a level of like working for the community to flourish while if the church is flourishing, that there should be this like overflow. And I do like that idea of the personal sanctification and discipleship and all of that is important, and also the social kind of outworking of what it means to live out the gospel in our communities, and to pursue that kind of wholeness together was one of the things I thought of.
I'm actually it's really strange up here, but I actually go to Rachel's church now. So I went
You
to
started
his
with him,
church, and now I go to Rachel's church, which is kind of a funny thing. Maybe it'll be yours next. I don't know. But I do have to say, in between those things, my own experience, our family's experiences, we attended 3 churches, two of which ceased to exist, and the third one lost about 90% of their group, of their people. And so we laugh that this church probably doesn't want us there because we have a track record that's not good when we join the church, and just goes downhill from there.
It's been fine so far.
Yeah, it seems, but we haven't done anything, so maybe that's why we're just, we just attend. But truly, like, having seen the difference, I think, a little bit, and if you've ever been in a church that's in decline and watching the flourishing, trying to find little bits of flourishing that are still there, and finding relationships that create flourishing even in very desert spaces, and then, coming to a point where it's like, okay, there's 10 of us left, and we feel the Lord saying it's time. So those kinds of experiences are a little bit of my story. But I do think that there is something very serious about serving, and very serious about the role model. So even in those churches in decline, and now in this really lovely church that we really, really deeply appreciate, there are people there who are loving on the Lord, who are flourishing, who are quiet, sitting in the pew sometimes. And then you get to know them, and you're like, wow, oh, you go to this homeless thing? Oh, like, I met this one woman in our church now, and like, she's a former alcoholic. She works with the homeless a lot. And I'm like, I want to do that. And so I'm like, when do you go? Like, I want to go do that. And so there's something beautiful about being around people who are doing that in a community that creates flourishing in ways that on my own, I don't think I would ever have jumped into and done.
I remembered one other thing that your answer made me think of, just with, in my own church experience, my parents couldn't seem to stay in a church for more than 2 years when I was growing up, and just chronically church hopped and couldn't find a place that they agreed with, and that, that their preferences were a fit with. And that I thought about that in terms of what we had mentioned earlier with social media, and this kind of low threshold of entry and exit. And one of the things also that's been really restorative to me in my adult life is committing to be in a church community even when I haven't gotten as much out of it in different seasons, or I felt frustrated with certain aspects of the leadership or whatever it is, or I've disagreed with a certain theological opinion or something like that. But that, I think, is another depth of relationship in that community that goes beyond kind of like marriage, of like, it's not just about this lovely feeling in the moment, but like a commitment to, I want to learn to do life with these people, and to become like Jesus might mean that I am not comfortable or having my preferences met sometimes, or maybe even most of the time.
So some of the things that you were saying reminded me of something that Laura House spoke about this morning, about like assessing kind of the strengths of people in the congregation, so that finding kind of where they can serve best, and that's how a church could flourish. What's it? The asset-based community development, making sure I have your term right there, ABCD. So yeah, I mean, you guys saying that just kind of reminded me of that. If you have other thoughts about, if you have specific thoughts about how we can do that in a church, how we can, I just know even in my church, it's every week, it's like, hey, do you want to volunteer? What are you good at? What do you want to do? And I don't know that anybody ever answers those calls, but you know, they're trying to do that, right? That's, I can see the match between something specific and this kind of general idea. So thoughts about that specifically, how can we call people in through their strengths in the church, but also, you know, that sounds very applicable to therapy and helping an individual client flourish as well. And so thoughts about how you incorporate that, helping people to identify their strengths to flourish.
I have a client right now who is really struggling with some depression, anxiety, and a lot of things of that nature. And she is an artist and loves beauty. Like, that's one of the things that we've kind of discovered is like a really core thing for her, is like recognizing beauty in the world and creating beautiful moments, whether that's in her home or even just like just walking through a store and finding out like that's a beautiful shirt or that's a beautiful arrangement. That just means so much to her. And I don't know that she would consider that like a gift to serve a church community with, but it certainly is, though, too. The folks who are able to create those types of beautiful experiences or hospitality. And so I think that, kind of widening the view of it's not just leading a Bible study or, serving in childcare or something like that, the more traditional roles maybe, but all these other, that any gifting can be used in the church in some fashion if we're creative enough for it.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit differently about it, that sometimes I've been able to use like abilities, giftings in church, leading a group or something, like having had good group training at VCU comes in handy for that kind of stuff. But actually a lot of the volunteerism, if we think about it at that level, Laura's wonderful model, I love your model, has been like, where is God wanting me to grow? Right? Like, this is something, like, honestly, what happened with my friend who does stuff with Pin Ministry in the area, she, I was talking to her, and at the same time, I had actually heard a sermon that was convicting, like an online sermon that had said, who do you know in your world that is poor, right? That is low income, low need, high need, that kind of thing. And I went, oh, man. I have actually gotten to a place in my life where I don't have people. Like, I live in a nice neighborhood. My kids are grown, so we don't have that kind of interaction anymore. That's convicting. That was convicting. And that same week, I'm talking to this new friend at church. And I'm like, okay. So I wasn't doing that because I had some gifting to give to, I just went and literally like, here's your dinner. Here's your dinner, kind of thing. And do you want prayer? That was the whole ministry. And I've found that, like, that's a different way maybe of thinking about it. Like, yeah, people could say, hey, Jen, you can teach things, or you can lead groups, or about marriage stuff. Sure, I'm happy to do that. But sometimes it's really important, I think, sometimes to just sit on the floor with the kids or, do something you're not gifted at, to be honest, because it is a way of the Lord working in me to make me more of who I'm supposed to be in Christ.
So Christ Pres is a fairly small church. We probably have 80 adults. And so our idea of a gifted person is anyone who is breathing regularly. And so I, really identify with what Jen said. It's like, we just want people to be able to get engaged in church, ministry, and so we are so grateful if they're breathing and they're willing to do that.
Although your deep dive stuff that you do is pretty dang good, as you might say in a Tennessee accent.
Yeah.
Call you out.
Yeah, we do kind of campaigns for virtue, and this came out of research. So amazingly, that research does some good every once in a while. But they're like 2 week. They're about 7 week or 6 week programs that we have every year, aimed at a deep dive into a virtue. And so, because it's a small congregation, all of the groups in the church, whether they're weekly groups or whether they're like the women's group or the other group that meets in the manse, but it's not the man's group. Okay, so but at any rate, everybody kind of concentrates on the virtue of the year, and then I invite in people to do talks about that are like world-renowned folks coming to give talks to 25 people that generously, they're serving, the kingdom too, and so those things have been really good, and then I, because I can't kick the habit, I do evaluate those statistically. Don't publish it though.
I don't know what I'm kind of taking from this. You're hearing here is like flourishing would involve a combination of like solidifying the identity, like the stuff that you identify with and are good at, and being able to focus on that, but also expanding the identity and having it be bigger than maybe wherever you are right now. Kind of expanding that would be an important part of flourishing. I don't know if you have thoughts or reactions to that thought that I had.
I can't improve on that in any way. I can only act to the detriment of that. That's very good.
Amen.
It makes me think of the sermon series at our church right now on the, Moses being called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and he's like, I don't talk well. I don't they're not going to listen to me. He's got a laundry list of excuses, and God's like, I don't care about any of that. Like, I'm going to equip you to do it. So, kind of to your point, Jen, like maybe it's not always about what we think we're good at, but whatever God might be wanting to do for His glory.
So what do you think that, as, again, whatever you're defining kind of your role is, whether that's working kind of big with church, small with individual clients, with students, what do you think you need, whether that's a skill that you feel like you need to develop, or kind of resources that you feel that you need to be able to better assist that kind of target population in flourishing?
Yeah, the Church Cares program that Jim and I are just starting up this year is making some of that gap very clear for me. Like I'm noticing it, and it's like a cross-cultural experience in some ways, because the church operates differently than academia or clinical psychology, psychotherapy kind of land. And it's exciting to do something new, but it's also like, oh, we need to communicate, and we can't just like send a quick email. Like, we got to learn MailChimp. We're gonna have to like package things, because that's the language of church curriculums and programs, and we have to speak the language of the communities that we're trying to serve. And so I think that in some ways, the training in psychology and mental health is helpful, because you do learn those skills. You just have to think about applying them to, okay, I'm now working in community-based work, and I'm now working in a culture that, yes, I attend church, but I'm not a minister, I'm not a staff member, and so I'm having to think like a minister, like a staff member, and do that kind of cross. And so I think for all of us working with churches and in church settings, to really get to know like the culture of church, even though we think we know it, it is a little bit different, I think, to come alongside as to help staff and ministers and those kinds of folks. Yeah.
So I'm very parallel with what Jen's saying here. I think, we go to a clinical training program or a counseling training program, you learn therapy for the most part. But I think what we need when we're applying it broadly in public health and in community health and in church health is more psychoeducation. Because that's accessible to everybody, not just to the 15% who, need, clinical help. So I think more psychoeducational, resources that anybody can use and is available, I think that's what we really need. And of course, because that's what I do, that's what I think people need. We call that projection. I am turning myself in for clinical help.
Is our time till 2? Is that okay? So I think I'll move on to my last question then, since we're just about at time. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what new innovations you've heard about Flourishing just these past 2 days here at the summer school that are most kind of exciting to you, that you think will have the greatest kind of practical implications for the work that you do.
I think one thing that I heard that I'm very excited about, it's just, I've got to make a talk to a big network of pastors this fall, and they wanted me to talk about things that pastors struggle with, that they need forgiveness, they need to work, to forgive. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and someone in the working group yesterday talked about why pastors burn out. And I thought that has a lot wider application than just pastors. But what he was saying was that there is this negative affect versus positive affect balance. And how if that balance stays relatively near the midpoint or even more positive than negative, then it's easy to hold on to. But the problem is negative emotions change a lot more quickly and a lot more dramatically often than positive emotions. And so the negative emotions can swing up and people feel really dissatisfied and burned out as a result of that. And so, how do you keep those negative emotions from just taking over and poisoning your whole view of what ministry you were called to, whether that's pastoral ministry or being a psychologist and ministering to folks as a psychologist? And I think obviously forgiveness is important there, that when somebody leaves the church, because they don't like you or they didn't like your sermon, or they think you're too political, or they think you're not political enough, or you think you're too Democratic or too Republican, and half of them will leave for each reason, So, in those cases where we feel, hurt and wounded, obviously forgiveness is a way of, dealing with those negative affective feelings before they get out of hand, hopefully. And the other, way is to, then think about that positive side of the affective balance and how do you increase the positive side. I was, we have a wonderful pastor, had a wonderful pastor, he just left, and I'm working on forgiveness, but no, I'm not. He's got a great position that he's going to. But he and I walked regularly, and I asked him once, I said, what is it that really keeps you engaged with the ministry? And he thought about that, and he said, being a pastor, he says, I love to preach, and he's great at it. He says, I love to preach, but the thing that I really love is I get to be with people in the congregation at these times in their life that are the most emotional and meaningful times. The marriages, the births of new children, the times of dealing with disease or death or tragedy of some kind. He says, I just can't see how you could have a better job than that. I thought, well, as I thought about giving this talk to these pastors, I thought if they could really think about those things that keep them engaged with the ministry, that might provide a buffer that kind of takes some of the edge off of those negative rejections and experiences that create hurt.
I really appreciated the mention of suffering being a part of flourishing yesterday. I found that very intriguing and encouraging. Even earlier this week, I was talking with a foster care support group that's in our church, and in doing fostering, they're knowingly signing up for a lot of grief and ripples of impact on their family and loss, and that there could be a space to see that as flourishing still in the midst of really a lot of turmoil that they're welcoming into their homes in different ways. I just really appreciate that. I found that very encouraging over these last few days.
And it's 2:00, so I'm going to make it really, really fast. But I would just say that I've really enjoyed actually the small nature of this has made it such that we get a chance to actually kind of get to know people a little bit more in depth. And I've really appreciated that the character of the people. I think about, what Tyler Vanderweel was saying about his own personal journey, and Laura, having a chance to talk to you and to Richard and to others here about what it is about who you are that has led you towards serving the church, and the personal gifting and way your brain works that is being used to promote ministries, and that's just really beautiful. So.
And thank you so much to all of you for sharing your thoughts and journeys with us as well. Thank you for your attendance. Appreciate your time.